I'm Dr. David Stewart. I'm a seismologist, and I'm in the New Madrid Museum as we speak. I have been studying the New Madrid earthquakes for some years and have written 5 books on it. And it was probably the largest outburst of seismic activity ever, at least for a long period of time. Back in 1811 and 12, starting on the 16th of December, was a huge shock. About 2:15 in the morning, which is centered somewhere, we believe, around where Blytheville, Arkansas is today. And then before the day was over, the next 24 hours, there was 4 more shocks, and they all had surface magnitudes of around 8 on the Richter scale. So they were really tremendous. Those shocks were felt all the way from the East Coast, Canada, Mexico, the island of Cuba, Rocky Mountains. They were the most widely felt earthquakes in American history. President Madison was awakened in the middle of the night by one of those shocks, and the people in Washington, D.C. actually thought the earthquakes were there because they were felt so strongly. And it wasn't until some weeks later that they realized, because the news traveled slowly, that they came from the New Madrid, Missouri area, right here where I'm standing. This museum that I'm in is a wonderful display of all the aspects of earthquakes, including the New Madrid earthquakes in general. They have a shake table so you can build a structure and see if it will stand. If you can figure out how to brace it right, you can build a little 3-story building if you like. And then they have something wonderful. They have the IRIS earthquake monitor, which is monitoring earthquakes all over the world in real time. And so I can actually go over there and push one of the little red dots and see where that earthquake happened. Here I'm just over there on the Persian Gulf, and it said that they had an earthquake today at 3 in the afternoon. It's pretty current. And then they have ones that go back in time, and you can go to any place in the world and see what's happening. Here's up in Alaska, and that one happened today about 1:25. So that's right here in the museum. And they have lots of wonderful, they have also a little seismograph over here where you can come in and jump up and down and make an earthquake, and it'll record it for you. But these earthquakes changed the landscape in this area permanently. They have a wonderful display of photographs here in the New Madrid Museum. There's 3 of them here that I like a lot. This is actually a fault line. They call it the boot heel fault. It's a strike slip. It moves like this. And out of the fault boiled sand during the earthquakes and created this huge mile-long deposit of sand. We call that a sand boil. This picture right here is really good. This is New Madrid itself from an aerial view, and you see the little white, light-colored round circles all over the ground? Those are places where the ground actually turned into quicksand from beneath and boiled to the surface and left a circular deposit. And any houses or anything that would have been on those would have sunk into the ground. And back in 1811 and 12, there were houses and barns that did sink. And so the city of New Madrid is built right over this zone. And you can see people have actually built homes over those areas. And let's hope that we don't have any big earthquakes for a long, long time, because they will liquefy again and you'll be on quicksand. I like this picture. This is the New Madrid golf course. And that is a sand boil on the golf course. It's a seismic sand trap. Not too many golf courses have one of those. This area for, I don't know, 50 miles long and 25 miles wide has got thousands of evidence of what happened 200 years ago. There are places where the ground broke open and there's huge fissures, and we can still find those. There's still deep fissures. And people were afraid of falling into those during the earthquake. They noticed that most of the fissures were north and south, and so these lasted for 5 months. There were hundreds and hundreds of earthquakes, and so they learned that they would lay logs east and west, and then if an earthquake started, they'd run out and sit on the log, and then if the ground opened up, they already had a bridge across the crevice. They actually did that. And I mean, they lasted so long and for so many days that they had time to think about it and plan things. This is a map of the major shocks of 1811 and 12. And the whole thing started down here. This is the Arkansas-Missouri line, the bottom of the Missouri boot heel. Blytheville, Arkansas is in this area. And this particular earthquake had a surface wave magnitude of 8.6. It was the first of the shocks. And then later that same day, there was an 8.0 surface wave magnitude right here at where Steele, Missouri is today. And then here, a little further up the river, on the same day, at 11 o'clock in the morning, was another one, and that's pretty close to where Caruthersville, Missouri is today, and there was a little town there called Little Prairie, which sank into the ground slowly over that day, and the people soon found themselves knee-deep in water, so they had to wade for several miles in this direction to get up to high ground to get out of there. So the whole town disappeared. There's no trace of it today. And people were carrying their children on their shoulders, wading in water hip deep and waist deep. And you can imagine all the animals and the possums and raccoons and coyotes and snakes also swimming for their own lives in that. It was really quite a scene. They walked northward. Meanwhile, later that day, well, earlier actually, at 9 o'clock was another shock here. No, this was a month later in January. And but as they walked up towards New Madrid, which is way up here, they took them from the 16th of December until Christmas Eve to get there. And they thought they would find some relief when they got to New Madrid, and then they found out New Madrid was destroyed too. And everybody was sleeping out of doors and houses had collapsed. And so it's just hard to imagine the hardships they went through. It was winter time, it was cold. And a lot of people left New Madrid and they walked all the way north, clear up here, about 20 miles north to where there are some hills. They started, if they get out of the flat ground, they could probably be safe on the hills. But they didn't know until they got there. The hills were full of landslides and they were unstable too. And they described a scene where people of all religions were on that hill praying together. So earthquakes actually do bring people together, and there was a tremendous religious revival after those earthquakes. The membership of the Methodists, the Baptists, and believe it or not, the Quakers and the Shakers also had an increase in membership. And but after about a year, a lot of those members didn't keep coming back to church, and so they call them earthquake Christians. Can't depend on them. And so there's a lot of social impacts of these quakes. We don't know how many people died in the earthquakes because there were no good newspapers or reporters or people keeping records. A few people did, and one of them was Eliza Bryan, who was a New Madrid resident at the time, and she wrote some wonderful letters describing how she experienced it with her family. And one of the major pieces of culture that suffered the most from these earthquakes were the Native Americans. And we don't have a good census on them, but they outnumbered the white settlers. And so there were probably several thousand Native Americans living up in this whole region in here. And down here in this area, there was way down here actually, near where Helena, Arkansas is today, there was a tribe, and during the earthquakes the ground sank, flooded their village, and not all of them survived. Many drowned. Near Osceola, Arkansas, which is right about here, there was another Indian village. They too sank into the ground, and we don't even have a count of how many went into the river from that. The boats that were on the river, because this was the main artery of transportation, many of them sank. There was a fleet of 19 boats here at New Madrid the night the earthquake hit. 18 of them took off and went downriver. One of them stayed, and the 18 that left were never seen again. They somehow capsized or sank in this stretch with all the earthquakes happening continuously. Every 10 minutes, every hour, they were just never did stop. It just so happened that up in Pittsburgh, a couple of weeks earlier before the quakes, the very first steamboat on the Mississippi came down the river, starting on the Ohio River. And they were somewhere up in this region, a little place called Yellow Bank, not far from Henderson, Kentucky. It was a coal mining district. That's where they were moored for the night on the big earthquake. And they felt the earthquake, didn't know what it was. And as they came down a few days later, they passed by New Madrid and saw this area that was totally devastated. Trees broken off and banks caved in, boats capsized, thrown up on the banks, things like that. But the steamboats survived just well because they came down just a little bit after the quakes, and they finally made it to New Orleans. But they had stories to tell. And probably in the history of the United States, there have been bigger earthquakes than this. They've had bigger ones than this in Alaska. And they've had swarms of earthquakes, or there'll be thousands of earthquakes in a short time. But I don't think we've ever had so many big earthquakes, and so they'll last for so long, for 5 months, that we ever had right here. So this was really a distinctive event in the history of the United States. And we don't believe the big one, like we just had 200 years ago, will come again for at least another 200 years. We're crossing our fingers on that. We know they've happened before because there's Indian legends about it, and there's a geologic evidence of their occurrence. And we believe that maybe every 5, maybe even every 600 or 700 years is when we can expect these huge events. And it's only been 200 years, so that's a short time geologically. But we do know they will happen, and what we're really concerned about today is not that a magnitude 8 is going to occur, but a magnitude 5 or a 6. A magnitude 6 should occur about once every 80 to 100 years. And the last time we had a magnitude 6 was 1895. So it's been over 100 years since we had a magnitude 6. Now we've had several magnitude 5s in that interval time. And even the magnitude 5 will be felt over 20 states or more, maybe even as many as 30 states, and do damage in 4, 5, or 6 states. So we definitely have an earthquake risk here. It's just that it skips a few generations before we really have a bad one. The one that happened in 1895 was a 6.7. It was centered up near Charleston, Missouri, which would be up in this area right here, the upper end of the fault. And there was only one fatality. It killed a donkey in Sykeston, Missouri, when the barn collapsed. But that was the only death we had. And let's hope we can be so lucky in the future. So that'll give you an idea of what they went through in 1811 and 12 and what we can expect in the future. And so all of us who live down here, we prepare for earthquakes because we know that very likely in our lifetime there'll be a serious one, maybe even of getting close to a 7, but in the 6s we can expect that. The consequences of the big earthquakes that happened in 1811 and 12 are still with us today. We have permanent lakes that formed. One of the biggest ones is Reelfoot Lake over in Tennessee. There are actually a dozen lakes that formed in that earthquake. All but 2 of them have been drained to expose the land for agricultural purposes. But one lake, Big Lake on the Arkansas-Missouri line, and Reelfoot Lake are still here. And they're quite large, and they now provide recreation for people who live here today. Record of the earthquake that happened 200 years ago comes from individuals who wrote letters. There were no reporters, there were no television cameras, there weren't any of the news media that we have today. So we had to get it from snatches from here and there. There was a gentleman, an engineer in Louisville, Kentucky. Now that's several hundred miles away from New Madrid. It's up the Ohio River. And he took an interest because he felt, I believe, 700 or more earthquakes in Louisville, Kentucky that came from here. And so he set up a little instrument that would record the shocks, and he counted them. So we have a good record, at least, of the number of shocks that he did. And then there was a physician up in St. Genevieve, Missouri, which is about only 100 miles from here, and he kept a record of what he felt up there. And so we have some idea of the numerous quakes that occurred and an estimates of their sizes. We get that from looking at the ground effects. We can see how much ground disturbance took place, how much offset may be on a fault, and calculate a good estimate of the sizes.
Hi, I'm Marion McDonald, and I have the honor and pleasure of getting to be Eliza Bryan tonight. This is really kind of a dream for me. I really never thought I would actually get to do that. A couple of years ago, I've been interested in the New Madrid earthquakes for, gosh, maybe my whole life. I did grow up around here. A couple of years ago, I realized that we were a couple of years out from the bicentennial, and I thought, gosh, I bet they're going to have a big, a celebration event. And I'd love to take part in that. Maybe I could, be a stagehand or something like that. And I went on the internet and I found some people that were involved with that. And I wrote cold emails to these people. It's like, you don't know me, but here's who I am. And I said, I'd really love to take part. And they, all 5 of them answered me. And several of them said I should talk with Phyllis Steckel, who's with the U.S. Geological Survey. And to make a long story short, here I am in New Madrid. And I actually have the honor of getting to portray Eliza Bryan. Now, Eliza was a real woman who lived in New Madrid, survived the 1811-12 earthquakes. She's actually buried here in New Madrid. I've gone up to her grave a couple of times just to make sure she's on board with all of this. Seems to be pretty good. The thing that makes Eliza noteworthy is that she left one of the best, clearest, most accurate descriptions of what actually went on in New Madrid itself. So her descriptions have been a great source of good, solid, credible information. She's been portrayed in various books, and she's always portrayed as a serious, reasonable woman. And I thought, well, boy, don't I have a lot of nerve asking to be the main character. There's going to be, all these New Madrid people want to do it. Turned out that actually they were happy to have me do it. So I'm delighted to be here. I will get into character. Eliza is really kind of daunted by 21st century stuff. So she looks a little bit, like the lights blow her backwards, because she never saw anything brighter than a kerosene lamp. They were writing with quill pens, and she didn't have any quill pen in her grave with her, so she's having to use modern pens. But we did get her a proper dress. So she's happy to be here with us tonight, and I gather we're going to be talking with her in a little bit later on. That's how I got started with all of this. My name is Eliza Bryan. I've lived in New Madrid for a lot of years, but I've been dead for a lot of years too. It's very strange for me to be in, they tell me now it's 2011, 200 years ago we had our quakes. Well, things sure have changed a lot, but I understand y'all are interested in me just telling what it was like with our quakes back 200 years ago. I laid in that grave for 150 years, so it's kind of, the memories are a little on the dim side, but I'll tell you what I remember. That first big one, none of us really knew what to expect. We weren't expecting anything. It was the middle of the night. It was 2 in the morning. We were asleep. And all of a sudden, this huge shaking is throwing us out of our beds, and we thought our houses were going to fall down. We all go rushing out of our houses, and none of us had a light. We couldn't find our flint. We couldn't even find each other in the dark. It was new moon, and there had been a pretty starry night prior to that, but this sudden dark vapor just obscured everything, even the stars. We couldn't see anything. Well, the other thing was the noise defied description. There was this rumbling thunder from under the ground. It was like thunder, but hoarse and more vibrating, and it was from everywhere, and the ground is carrying on, and every bird and beast of the air is screaming, and of course the people were screaming and running in all directions, which that's how we eventually found each other, it was just by the sound. Somebody finally got brave enough to go back into one of the houses and get some fire, so we were able to make a fire. But that was the middle of the night, and it shook the rest of the night. Not all the time, but frequently. We just kind of huddled up in our quilts and waited for morning. Fortunately, it wasn't real cold at that point in time, although it did get cold later. And we waited for the dawn, and we thought, oh, thank goodness, at least we've got some light we can see. And the sun had only been up for a little time. Here's another huge shake. And we're thinking, how long is this going to go on? Well, no one knew then. It went on for months. The big hard shake was not till 3 months later, February. The first one was on December 16th. Then there was another big one on January 23rd. And from January 23rd to February 4th, the earth was in nearly continuous movement like the waves on a gentle sea. And I know it's hard to believe, but I'm just telling you, that's what I saw. And then we finally got to the hard shock of February 7th, And that was the one that just beat all. And most folks just up and left after that. They thought, because they were getting worse. Nobody really knew after that hard shock, they did begin to taper off. And I understand y'all here still have a little one every once in a while, but they told me they're not really expecting any more big ones like we had, but they might have some medium-sized ones. So that's kind of why I agreed to come up out of my grave to talk about what we went through, so that people can, you know, most of us did survive. It's not, I hear people nowadays, they say, oh, we're doomed, there's nothing we can do. That's not true. We survived and we had nothing like y'all got. So there's things you can do to make your life easier than what we had it, and that's what I come back to help with.
My name is Cathy Kelly, and I have a design company out of Memphis, Tennessee called K-Design. And I was asked by the board of the New Madrid Historical Museum to come up with this earthquake exhibit. And I thought I'd share with you some of the interesting things that I learned in my research. One of the first things I learned that I didn't realize was about plate tectonics. And we have a large map here in the museum from the USGS. And what this shows you is that earthquakes and volcanoes happen primarily on plate boundaries. And the world is made up of these plates, which people think they're all stationary, but they actually are slowly moving. And one of the things that you might say, well, how does that affect us here in New Madrid? Because we're not on one of those plate boundaries. And so one of the things I learned through Dr. Stewart and his research is that studies have shown that, or some scientists think, that what originally happened was, instead of the East Coast breaking off from Africa in what we now know as continental drift, that it might have been that line that's the Mississippi River. And so it didn't break there, it broke at the East Coast, but that gives you a weak spot. So that is the area where the river formed, and that is the area where faults formed, and so therefore that is an area that is prone to have earthquakes.
Hi, I'm Darcy Kramer, and I work here at the New Madrid Museum in New Madrid, Missouri. And I've been here 9 years, and I enjoy every moment of it because there's so much going on in history. Now, this fault, the New Madrid Fault, is in 5 states. It's in Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois. There were over 4,000 earthquakes since 1974. Now they go from real minute to large earthquakes. Now this is another section of our room where the eyewitness tells us the story. Now Eliza Bryan wrote a letter because she went through it. She was and all we do here now is we pick up this phone and press Eliza Bryan. And then you have 1 minute and 10 seconds worth of what she talks to you. And it's, she was a brilliant writer. She described everything really well. And then another one that we could listen to would be a young man, Matthias Speed, John Weissman, Godfrey LeSueur, and William Clark. Now here, the River First Steamboat, the New Orleans was made its maiden voyage down the river, down the Mississippi, and it was Mr. Roosevelt, and they called it the New Orleans. He also would not dock in New Madrid because there were too many people on shore wanting to get on. His wife was giving birth to a baby. He was afraid if he went and docked that the boat would be too many people and the boat would sink, and there'd be riots with the people wanting to get on, and too many would get on. So that's another historic feature that you don't hear too much about, but it's real life. You know, he just made a decision. He could not land. He could not dock. And we do have earthquakes every week. They're printed in our newspaper. They're small, they're not big, they're 1.6, 2.3, 3.3, but there's only been a couple 4s and 4.5. So that's not really anything to worry too much about. So it's interesting, and like I said, they're in our newspaper every week. We get to see what happens.